How the Great Religions Began by Joseph Gaer. Book 2, The Religions of China and Japan. Part 1, Confucianism-The Teachings of Great Sage. Not going far enough is bad, and going too far is not any better. The man who knows how to keep the middle between extremes has understanding. And how is one to know whether he's going far enough, yet not too far? And how is one to lead the good life? Kaig asked. Will the right hold to the good one, rest in love, and move in art? These are the ways of leading the good life. Though Kaig had studied much, he found difficulty in understanding immediately what his father told him, and he repeated it slowly, trying to understand each. Will the right hold to the good one, W-O-N, rest in love, and move in art? Yes, think of these, my son. And now I must get back to my work. Confucius went on with his work, but not for very long. For in 478 BCE, Confucius died. When the news became known, his death was mourned all over China, all over the Chinese Empire. Even the rulers who had neglected him during his life paid homage to his memory. Many of his pupils and followers mourned his death for 3 years as if he had been their own father. A number of them even built small shelters near Confucius's grave and remained there all the days of their mourning, studying his teachings. Section 9. Close to the tree falls its fruit. When Confucius died, Kaig set to work to collect the sayings and teachings he had learned from his grandfather. Kaig was a poor man, but he gave all his time to the book, which was on the doctrine of the middle path, as taught by Confucius. To support himself while working on his book, Kaig taught pupils who came to him. Look, teacher, his pupils would sometimes say to him, your coat is old and going to pieces, and you have so little to eat. The master said, Kaig would reply, always calling Confucius the master and never my grandfather. The master said that a scholar in search of truth who was ashamed of poor clothes and poor food is not worth talking to. Sometimes Kaig did not have enough to eat, and then his friends would send him food, such food as he needed to keep soul and body together. He thankfully accepted, but wine and luxuries of dried meat he refused to take. Even the rice and vegetables he accepted. He took only from people whom he respected. Once a rich man who heard that Confucius's grandson was in need sent him food and clothing. Having been told how careful Kaig was in accepting gifts, he sent a servant along with the gifts to give Kaig this message. When I borrow from a man, I forget. When I give a thing, I part with it as freely as if I threw it away. The servant returned with the gifts, saying that Kaig would not accept them. Did he give you any reasons? The rich man asked. No, the servant replied. The rich man went to Kaig and asked him, I have plenty, and you have not. Why will you not accept my gifts? You give away your things as if you were throwing them into a ditch. Kaig replied, Poor as I am, I cannot think of my body as a ditch. That is why I cannot accept your gifts. In that way, the grandson of Confucius taught the Chinese that they who give charity should have sympathy, and they who take charity should have self-respect. Kaig went on with his work, happy to see the fame of his father's teachings traveling all over China. Mang Ke Tse, called Mencius, the true founder of Confucianism in the historical sense. A little over 100 years after the death of Confucius, a child was born in Lu. He was named Mang. The many rulers of China were still selfish and unjust as in the days of Confucius, and when Mang grew up, he began to teach against the princes and ministers who thought only of their own good and not of the good of the people they were ruling. Mang gathered about him many pupils and taught them the wisdom of Confucius, which we call Confucianism. His pupils called Mang Tse, meaning Mang the philosopher. We call him Mencius. Mencius went to the ruler of Lu and asked him to rule the land of Lu. But the Duke according to the teachings of Confucius, but the Duke of Lu refused to listen to him. So Mencius gathered a number of his followers and started out over the empire in search of a ruler who would be willing to govern his people, as Confucius taught. Wherever Mencius came, he was received with great respect, for his fame as a philosopher was known all over the land. "What is this just and wise rule you are teaching?" the dukes would ask him. "What I teach is nothing new. The master Confucius taught it before me. A just ruler governs his people according to the 5 constant virtues as taught by the master. And what are the 5 constant virtues? The 5 constant virtues are benevolence, the desire to work for the good of people; righteousness, not to do unto others as you would not they should do unto you; propriety, always to behave with courtesy towards the people you rule; wisdom, to let knowledge and understanding be your guides; sincerity, to have sincerity in all ye do, for without sincerity, according to the master, the world cannot exist." Now, this isn't a complete account or everything or whatever, but there are gaps when you have philosophies. And when you have conservative traditions, you may explain some things, but you narrow down the possibilities. These are the 5 constant virtues a ruler ought to follow. The dukes and princes listened to what Mencius had to say, but none took his advice, and Mencius moved on to other provinces. For 20 years he traveled about in that way, and though he failed to find one prince or duke who would follow his advice, he succeeded in spreading the teachings of Confucius. And each place he left it with a greater love for the wisdom of the master. The growing love and understanding of Confucius among the people encouraged Mencius to go on with his work of spreading Confucianism. Mencius died at the age of 83, nearly 2,300 years ago, but his memory is worshipped by millions of people to this day. The Chinese call Confucius the first sage of China, and Mencius is remembered as the second sage of China, much as Christianity is Paul. Jesus lost a lot of his influence or authority in the lieu of Paul and the Christians, teachers. But doesn't Confucianism, particularly Mencian, make you think of Stoic philosophy? Part 11. Now, the final one, apparently, okay. The criminal of 10,000 generations. The injustice and selfishness of all the dukes and princes and their ministers all over China became worse and worse as time went on, until about 250 years after Confucius died, a new emperor came to the throne of China who decided to make a complete change in the government. The emperor was named Tian Xie Huangte. Though he was only a young boy when he came to the throne, he made up his mind to take over the power of the entire country into his own hands. Of course, the dukes and all the provinces did not like that. But Tien went out north and south, and he conquered all the people that opposed him. After he had gathered all the power of China into his own hands, he proclaimed himself as the first emperor. There had been many, many emperors in China before him, but Tien called himself the first emperor to show the people that he wished them to forget all the old rulers that had come before him. It was as if the people had played a game on a blackboard until the slate was all marked up, and the players began to cheat badly. Then the boy emperor Tian came along and wiped the board clean, and told the people to begin playing from the beginning, and he would watch to see that there was no cheating going on. When his victories came over those who rebelled against him were complete, the emperor ordered a great celebration to be made in the palace, and all the ministers and the great man and the great men of the land to be invited. At the celebration, as was the custom, made speeches praising the emperor and wishing him a long life. Horrible rulers that expect to be praised instead of treated like human beings. We're forced by circumstances to say your honor or whatever at times, at least some people are. The Superintendent of Sports arose and said, "Happy is the kingdom of China under your majesty, great Emperor Tien Che Huangti. Before you, the empire was broken and weak, but your strength and wisdom, you have united the empire and made it strong. Before you, our empire was small. Now through your wisdom, it is so great that wherever the sun and moon shine, there people bow to your authority. This happy empire that your majesty organized will last in happiness for 10,000 generations. From the oldest days, there has been no empire so great as your majesty." This speech pleased the emperor, but then the great scholar Shan Yu Yae, arose and said, "The superintendent of sports shows himself a flatterer, and therefore he is not a loyal minister. In order to please your majesty, he has slandered the memory of our great ancestors, the emperors of the past." Now, freedom for sports and art and stuff like that, fine. But government funding, taxing the people, no, I don't believe that is right. Everybody around the tables began to murmur about the daring words of that scholar. One minister arose and said, "What you did, your majesty, is indeed more than a mere scholar can understand. These scholars do not understand what we are doing today. We only study what people did in the past and long ago. Now that your majesty has made our empire great, these scholars teach the people what is against your wish. The best way to keep these scholars from doing your majesty any harm is to burn their books, and the books written by the scholars of old, and all the scholars who teach them against your will should be put to death." The young Emperor Tien liked the minister's proposal. He sent out officers all over the land to gather the books of the great masters, especially the works of Confucius, his grandson Kaig, and his followers Mencius, and to have them all burned so that the memory of those scholars would be forgotten by the people. Remember Acts 19:19? And later, book burnings and destructions on behest of the church? And, multiplied under these secular rulers. Secular rulers have done so much more and so much more often, but it doesn't mean they have to take part of that. Books in China in those days were not written on paper as they are today. They were written on slips of bamboo about 1 inch wide and 2 feet long, and the writing was done with a sort of varnish. These slips of bamboo were bound together by punching holes in the corners and fastening them with cords of silk or leather, very much in the same way we keep loose-leaf books today. Naturally, those books were very big and very heavy. A book like the one you're now reading would weigh about 100 pounds in bamboo slips. All these heavy books from the royal libraries and the private homes began to be gathered not far from the palace of the emperor to be burned. That year, 212 BCE, was a sad year in China. Some of the officers and some of the scholars who loved the great works of their masters stole copies of the books and walled them into buildings where they could not be found. But most of the books were burned. For 3 whole months, the fires blazed not far from the royal palace. Day and night, the flames were fed with bamboo books. The people from all parts of the country gathered near the great fire, watching the flames throw huge shadows upon the royal palace. After the books were burned, the emperor ordered that the old scholars who had memorized the books and were teaching them should be put to death. Yeah, no compulsion, it's system of judgment. You shouldn't be doing these things, even no matter how wrong they are. About 500 scholars were killed, and hundreds of others were either driven out of the country or put to work on the Great Wall of China that was then being built. Several years later, when Emperor Tian died, the people took out the books that had been hidden in the walls and made a great holiday to celebrate the memory of Confucius and his followers, and the books that had been saved. The name of Confucius, which Emperor Tian wanted the people to forget, had become dearer than ever to them. And the memory of Tian was hated. Emperor Tian, after whose name we call his land China, Tianna, wanted to be remembered by his people, and the best emperor in 10,000 generations. But instead, the people of China remember him as the criminal of 10,000 generations.